Colby Covington has mastered the technique of gaslighting to manage his MMA career. Gaslighting is a term that was first coined to describe the mental manipulation that can go on in abusive relationships, and nowadays it's heavily and unfortunately a tactic often used in politics. Gaslighting is a form of psychological manipulation people use to gain power and control, and they do it often by denying the truth, straight up lying, or just creating confusion. And as it relates to Colby, when you look at how many times he's been able to leapfrog more deserving fighters and how many times he's been able to get himself into title fights, you have to stop and respect just how good he is at doing this. And I also find it fascinating how many people he's been able to rile up and completely confuse with regard to what's going on with him. So in this video, I'm going to tell you everything you ever need to know about Colby Covington so you can understand his career and what he's doing and why he's taking the approach that he's taking. But before I get into all that, if you enjoy the video, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I would appreciate having you on board for future content. Now, I know that many of you are already familiar with the story about Colby, where back in the day when he was winning fights on a regular basis, the UFC was still going to cut him because he wasn't exciting enough. So as a last-ditch effort, Colby just decided to go crazy on the mic when he was down in Brazil after beating Damian Maia. He called Brazil a dump and the people there filthy animals. And in that moment, the character that he is today was born, basically. So I just want you to stop for a minute and put yourself in the position that he was in at that time. Imagine that you're 28 or 29 years old and you're at that crossroads point where you're either going to make it in this sport or you're not. And even though you've been winning your fights and you're in your prime, it's still not good enough for you to keep your job. Oh, and by the way, if this doesn't work out, you're going to have to completely change the direction of your life. So in order to save yourself in your career, you adopt this personality that's very controversial and you find out that it actually works. But after time, you realize that it adds a tremendous amount of additional stress to the already stressful job of being a fighter, because now you're creating enemies everywhere you go, you're getting constant criticism, and people are just waiting to see you fail. Now, all the while that this is happening, you are realizing your place in the division is starting to fade, because on one hand, you're not able to beat the very top guys that are already in the division. At the same time, you're watching this really dangerous new generation coming up the ranks. And all of this is happening while you're turning 31, 32, 33, and now 36 years old. So when you put yourself in that position, it's a lot easier to sympathize with the situation that Colby is in. And what Colby has realized is that his best weapon has nothing to do with any of his MMA skills, but has everything to do with his ability to talk his way in and out of different situations. And once you understand all that about him, it's much easier to make sense of what he's doing right now. I am not at all surprised by how the Garry situation has unfolded, because I've already talked about it in 2 prior videos. The first time I discussed it was in the video I did right after UFC 299 when I was talking about the best next matchups to make. And then I did a fully dedicated video on it where I talked about how Colby is ducking Garry and why he's doing it. So let me make sense of it all for you by explaining the situation that Colby's in right now. The first thing that you have to do is stop thinking that Colby himself believes he's the best in the world and he's here to be champion by beating all of the best guys. Now, of course, he'll claim that in public interviews because he has to keep the image up. But in fairness, Colby absolutely had that mindset back when he was 29 and 28 years old. But now at 36, after 3 separate failed attempts to get the belt, as well as the wars and physical damage that came along with it, Colby knows that that ship has sailed. Now, don't misunderstand what I'm saying. Colby will fight for the title as many more times as he can talk himself into. But he is also very aware that the road ahead for him is very difficult no matter which direction he takes. Unlike a couple of years ago, there are no shoe-in matches left for him at this point in the top 10. So he knows at best he probably has 3 to 5 fights maximum left in his career, and maybe even as few as 1 if he has a devastating loss. And you have to keep in mind that because he has such little time left in the sport, he has to maximize the amount of money he's able to earn before it's over. And the best way for him to do that is, number 1, not to get that injured in his fights, and number 2, to make sure that the fights he does take are favorable enough where even if he does lose, he can just use his manipulation skills and then talk himself right back into another money fight. But he knows that doing that will be much harder if in his next fight he suffers a really embarrassing loss or a devastating one. That could truly be it for him. So he's going to try as best as he can to avoid guys who are bad matchups for him. And he's especially going to avoid the guys that he thinks present the biggest physical threats. And once you understand this, then you will understand why he just called out Belal Muhammad, because he feels like that is probably one of the safest matches that he has in the top 10. Now, as I discussed in the other videos where I addressed the Ian Garry situation, I do not believe that Colby sees Ian Garry as a big physical threat, but I do think he recognizes it's a really bad matchup for him from a points perspective. And while with almost anybody else he'd be perfectly fine with that, he does not like Ian Garry, and he does not want to give him the pleasure of having a win over him. And I've been saying that since early March, which was well before any of the stipulation stuff they had going back and forth. And this is why, even though that was really the perfect setup for a fight between these two guys, that you're not seeing it come together. Now, there's always the possibility that the UFC forces his hand and makes him take that fight, although at this point it doesn't look like it. So just to summarize all this up, if you start looking at Colby Covington through the lens of him wanting to make as much money as possible through the end of his career, all while taking as little damage and embarrassment as possible, as opposed to the idea of him wanting to prove that he's the best in the world, then everything that he's doing will make a lot more sense. So with that framing in mind, I will give you what I think are probably his most likely targets going forward. Again, I think he's looking at everyone first from a standpoint of what sort of physical threat do they present, and after that, I think he's looking at things like name ID to make sure he can make it the most profitable fight. And on that basis, I still feel like Stephen Thompson is probably the #1 name on his list. Now, I do happen to think that Stephen Thompson presents a bigger threat to him than he might think, but we've seen Stephen get controlled by grapplers many times, and we know that's what Covington is thinking. One of the other things I could see him doing is waiting around to see who loses between Leon Edwards and Belal Muhammad, and calling out the loser of that fight. Because in that scenario, he wins either way. He either gets to redeem his loss against Leon Edwards or fight Belal Muhammad, who he does not think is a big threat. After those potential matchups, I could see him looking at Gilbert Burns as a possibility, although I'm sure he thinks that's probably a bad matchup for him. And this may be surprising for certain people, but I think he could also be looking at Jack Della Maddalena later in the year. Now, I know you have to be careful talking about Jack Della Maddalena because he's second only to Alex Pereira in terms of having a rabid fan base. But the fact of the matter is JDM was getting out-grappled by Gilbert Burns and controlled, and Gilbert was well on his way to winning that fight when he made a critical error at the end that caused him to lose. And if you're not familiar with what I'm talking about, go watch the video I made with the thumbnail that says fumbled and you'll see that mistake. But the bottom line is, if Colby's looking for a big name and somebody that he could possibly control through grappling, JDM has to be high up on that list. Now, you do also have guys like Sean Brady in the mix, but I'm just not sure he has a big enough name ID to attract Colby's attention. And finally, I do have to say the Charles Oliveira call-out is actually really interesting. It's a fight that means absolutely nothing unless Charles Oliveira is serious at making a run at 170, but when I really think about it, it might be the most fun option that's out there for him right now. And it's actually really brilliant for Colby because that would definitely be the biggest money fight, I think, of all the different options for him. And Charles Oliveira said he was on board, so we'll have to see what the UFC does with it. Now, from a standpoint of those I think he would purposely avoid, I've already obviously mentioned Ian Garry. I also don't think he would want anything to do with MVP or Shavkat Rakhmonov. So no matter what, it's going to be interesting to see where Colby goes from here. But those are all my thoughts. Let me know down in the comments, what do you think about Colby? Do you think I'm right in my assessment of his career? And where do you think he goes in terms of his next opponent? As always, I'll look forward to interacting with you guys down in the comments. And once again, if you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button and be sure to subscribe if you haven't done that as well. Thank you all very much for being here. I always appreciate it, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.